Hello and welcome. My name's Philip, and today we're going to be continuing our series about the chain of being, the cosmology which informed a great deal of the medieval European worldview. In our last episode, we began looking at the medieval concept of identity and the other. In this episode, we're going to continue by discussing the medieval approach to the subject of history, where people saw their place in history and, of course, how it was influenced by their belief in the chain of being. Our understanding of history is an important factor in our sense of identity. It's having an idea of where we belong, not just in the world today, but in the unfolding narrative of time. Often, when we consider people in the past, we don't think about how they themselves may have considered their own place in history, how the world was before them, and the lessons that they take away from it. And of course, how their belief in divine order influenced all of that. First of all, it may come as no surprise that there was a reliance upon scripture. And yes, they understood that most of the Bible was to be read as allegory, but some parts, particularly the histories of the Hebrews and the tribes of Israel, were just that, histories. They were considered true and accurate accounts of real historical events and people. Things get a little blurry when it comes to the events of Genesis, but as a general rule, the Bible was a historical source. What this means is that the cultures that the Jewish people interacted with were also well known about. The ancient Egyptians, for example, would have been known as an ancient pagan civilization, even if your average medieval person wouldn't have known any more than just that. This also means that medieval people had a very strong understanding of the ancient Greeks and, more importantly, the Romans. In addition to the Bible, Greek and Roman texts which survived into the medieval period were also sources of history. Perhaps the most influential of these were the snippets of poetry and drama which fueled the medieval imagination. Poets and authors all across Europe enjoyed translating and putting their own twists upon these classical stories, reinventing them for their generation. The 12th century saw the height of this trend, where reworkings of classical stories formed one of the three great literary cycles. Jean Bodel, a 12th century poet, coined the terms when in his Roman de Cesne he declared, "With only three matters should man concern himself: of France, of Britain, and of Rome the Great." The matter of Rome actually contained quite a lot of Greek stories as well, but was mainly concerned with surprisingly medieval ideas of honour, nobility, and particularly the rise and downfall of empires. The most culturally influential works were the Alexander Romance, a story about Alexander the Great, the Roman de Troyes, about the rise and fall of Troy, and the Roman d'Aeneas, a medieval treatment of the Aeneid. To Western Europeans in the 12th century, the Roman Empire was often held up as exemplary, specifically the Christian Roman Empire, which was heavily romanticised by medieval writers. This is because it represented to them a society approaching that ideal of divinely ordained order. It covered most of the known world, spoke the same language, had a highly developed infrastructure, and worshipped Jesus Christ. And the accuracy of those claims was not as important as the idea that they represented. For a medieval European, walking down Roman roads to cities with Roman names, filled with huge edifices of Roman civilization, it was hard not to be impressed by the Roman achievement. The Roman Empire represented a society which very nearly reached that divine order. And so, a great many medieval texts appeal to the Romans for a sense of authority, even when it's entirely untrue, as is often the case in the second great matter that Bodel named, the matter of Britain. The matter of Britain, unsurprisingly, deals with the history of the British Isles in particular, filling in the gaps before the Romans arrived and between the Romans leaving and the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. And this is where stories about King Arthur and Camelot fit in, which were particularly enjoyed in the later Middle Ages. The matter is also concerned with the origins of the British people, and that is where things get interesting. According to Geoffrey of Monmouth's 1136 work Historia Regum Britanniae, or the History of the Kings of Britain, the nation of Britain was founded following the Trojan War, when the grandson of the Trojan Aeneas, who was named Brutus, travelled to the island and defeated the giants who were living there. He then renamed the land after himself because Brutus and Britain sound sort of similar, and he built a capital city which he called Troia Nova, or New Troy, later renamed London. The really strange thing is that Geoffrey of Monmouth wasn't just plucking this out of thin air, but actually based his work on a chronicle from the 9th century called the Historia Brittonum. Even when talking about Britain, medieval writers couldn't hide their admiration for the empires that came before them. So what happened to the Romans? If they were on their way to achieving that ideal of the chain of being, where did they go? Well, the medieval mind, the answer was simple. Pagans. Often the favoured term is actually barbarians, but the meaning is essentially the same. Non-Roman, non-Christian aggressors. And this narrative makes perfect sense in regards to the chain of being. If the Romans were achieving order, which is morally good, they could only be laid low by forces of chaos and immorality. Nowadays, we know that the reasons for the collapse of the Western Roman Empire were many and varied, and came just as much from within as without. But the chain of being allowed the medieval mind to view history in much starker terms of order and chaos, right and wrong. The Roman Empire is held up as a bastion of divine order, and its collapse is a warning against the predations of the other, the heathen, the pagan. This is where the matter of France comes in, which was chiefly concerned with another great historical emperor, Charlemagne. Now, these stories are why he was considered one of the 9 worthies, the exemplars of chivalric virtue. The tales of Charlemagne and his paladins and the Frankish expansion were viewed as Christians struggling to achieve divine order by battling or converting the pagan threat. Through his efforts, Charlemagne manages to create a new Roman Empire, a holy Roman Empire no less, named such not because of its size, but because of its ideals. And this is where we reach the real crux of the issue when it comes to the medieval understanding of history. With very few written sources and effectively no study of archaeology, exploring history in the Middle Ages was no easy feat. It required a great deal of time, effort, money, and no small amount of imagination. And so, if you were going to write a historical account, it needed to have a practical purpose. This is why there is a boom in national epics in the high medieval period. Almost exclusively commissioned by people in power, these histories had agendas to establish themes, to confirm lineages, to connect people and places, to create identities. And it wasn't just the three matters that Bodel described. The Gesta Normannorum Ducum, penned by William of Jumièges in 1060, relates the history of Normandy and actually became a living document added to by future scholars in order to include the conquest of England. 100 years later, Henry II commissioned the Roman de Rou, seeking to solidify the link between the Angevin kings and Normandy's Viking founder. Reinforcing themes of lineage and an unbroken connection to the past was another way of emphasizing the legitimacy and significance of social hierarchy, and therefore the chain of being. It may come as no surprise that this understanding of history also worked its way into the rhetoric of the medieval period, particularly as a means to justify warfare. The image of the Romans, the forces of order beset by the chaos of paganism, no doubt lingered in the minds of soldiers as they participated in the Reconquista, the Crusades, or really any war to topple a tyrant. For the medieval mind, history was often a malleable thing. The lack of solid evidence, academic rigour, and even high literacy rates meant that for most medieval people, history was small. It was local. It was folk tales and oral tradition. National epics were an exciting response to this, giving people a sense of identity which stretched beyond their borders, beyond their lifetimes. Sure, history was vague, but this just meant that people clung even harder to the truths that they had. The words of the Bible, the wisdom of the ancients, and of course, their belief in divine order. The past was uncertain, but the chain of being was eternal. Thanks for watching. Farewell. Hey everyone, thanks again so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. This was our fourth video in our Chain of Being series. There's still a couple more to come. So if you want to be notified when those come out, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell. Leave a like if you enjoyed our content and a comment. We do love to read your comments. Until next time though, take care, farewell.